Welcome to the webinar training series for the Equals Pre-Algebra and Pre-Geometry curriculum. In this webinar, participants will be provided with information regarding the assessment for the Pre-Algebra and Pre-Geometry math curriculum. If you have any questions, you can contact the curriculum team by email at curriculum@ablenetinc.com. Please feel free to contact us for additional support or follow-up questions. Remember that implementing a curriculum will take time, and one of the most important steps to being successful is to know what materials you have and how to organize them. Let's get started. The assessment is designed to identify what students know and understand about basic math concepts, as well as pre-algebra and pre-geometry skills and vocabulary. Students can be placed in pre-algebra and pre-geometry in a few different ways. Keep in mind that first and foremost, district guidelines will take precedence for the assessment process. Follow the protocol that is established and proceed from there. You can always begin at the very beginning of the pre-algebra and pre-geometry curriculum. However, you may want to consider what skills students already possess. If you know your students' math skills, maybe through a different assessment or from previous knowledge, you can use the contents pages found in the beginning of the teacher's guide. The list of objectives are organized from Section A to Section Q in the order in which they will be introduced. Decide which skills your student has, which skills they are struggling with, and find the starting point that you think would be appropriate for your student. It is important to feel comfortable and confident. Do not choose a lesson that will be beyond your student's current math knowledge, as the curriculum is new to them. If you choose the approach just discussed, using the contents pages, you can start teaching the student lessons and then confirm this placement by administering the assessment at a later time, after the student has been introduced to materials in a few of the lessons. If you need to adjust the starting point, the scores and contents pages will help you find a better place to continue. Last but not least, you can choose to use the Equals Pre-Algebra and Pre-Geometry assessment to place your students at the suggested starting point. After you administer the assessment, the student will receive an adjusted raw score that will correlate to a specific section based on their demonstration of math knowledge and understanding of math vocabulary. That score and section will determine an appropriate starting point. The assessment is made up of 5 subtests. These 5 subtests represent the 5 math content areas: data analysis and probability, geometry, measurement, and numbers and operations. There are materials that are required to administer the math assessment for both typical and adapted items on the test. The materials will come from your manipulative kit, your classroom, and some items will need to be printed from the members-only content. A majority of the printed items will be able to be used over and over again. It is highly recommended that you follow the assessment procedures so that you can administer the assessment with efficiency. This page gives assembly and printing directions to assemble the subtest assessment kits. You will need 5 jumbo zipper bags or other containers to hold the assessment kit materials. Follow the instructions for printing the assessment materials from the members-only content. As you print and gather your materials, place them in the appropriate subtest kit. Keeping your materials organized will help with efficiency when you are ready to administer the assessment. In the members-only content, you will find the list of classroom materials that you will need to gather to complete your assessment kits. The materials on this page you will want to keep in the assessment kit if possible. Most of the items should be easily found in your classroom setting. The list includes a dial scale and a meter stick. You would only need to purchase one for the assessment kit, and this can be shared among teachers using the curriculum. It is necessary for students to see the weight and actually observe the movement of a needle to relate a heavy item. Here you see the labels for the assessment subtest kits. You will also find these labels in the members-only content under Assessment. The materials you need to gather for each subtest from the Equals kit are labeled here as well, and this is where your manipulative kit organization will come in very handy. So when you are ready to assess your students, you can quickly gather the materials from the Equals kit by referencing these labels. Fasten these labels to the outside of each subtest bag so you know what to grab. Here's an example of the Numbers and Operations assessment bag. You will notice the label from the members-only content is fastened to the front, and the print materials are inside the bag along with the classroom materials. when it comes time to assess students, you can assess them in your math area so all of your manipulatives are within arm's reach. This is the student response booklet for recording performance on each item, which are divided into subtests. On the front page is where you will put basic student information, such as name, date of birth, age, and grade. This can be found in your Content Kit box and is also available in the members-only content. On the inside of the booklet is where you will record student responses to the items. When you look at the student response booklet, you will notice that the items are broken into subtests. Those subtests are designed around the math content areas that were discussed earlier. You will administer each subtest. The assessment also has a basal and ceiling method, so you will not necessarily ask every question in a subtest area. The subtests do not need to be administered in a certain order. However, once you begin a subtest, you will complete that subtest until the student reaches the ceiling before you move on to the next subtest. Mark 1 for correct responses and 0 for incorrect. Check the box if you have given the adapted item, and we'll come back to that in a moment. The last pages provide an area for students to write for specific test items. I recommend testing each student in a subtest before moving on. It is more efficient for students to be tested in this manner. It is important to reiterate that you may not ask all of the items on the subtest if a student reaches the ceiling. However, you will need to administer each subtest. Once you have your assessment kits organized and your student protocol sheets ready for each student, you can start testing. Here we have an example of what the questions in the assessment flipbook look like. The flipbook is a self-standing easel, so you will see one side and the student will see the other. The teacher side will display the instructions and the item question. The other side is for the student to reference. You will find typical and adapted questions for each question on the assessment. The assessment will be unique to each individual student, and you will be able to select the questions that are best for each student's understanding of math. Some student assessments will be all typical questions, some students might be asked all adapted questions, and some students will have a combination of questions. Typical versions measure the full understanding of a math concept. Students are asked to demonstrate the knowledge or understanding of a typical math skill or vocabulary word. The directions for the typical question will be found directly under the item number, as shown in our example for item 7. If the student answers the question correctly, you can feel confident knowing that the student has full understanding of that math concept. If the typical question is not appropriate for the student, or the student wasn't able to understand or perform the typical question, you could ask the adapted question. You can see in the example, below the typical question there is a space, and then it says adaptation. The adapted items give students the opportunity to show what the students know about a specific skill. The students might not have a full understanding of that skill, but they may be able to understand or demonstrate something related to that skill, and this question will support the student. This allows you to take away some information related to the skill, and can then see if the student is starting to emerge with their understanding of certain skills. Again, keep in mind that you can give the assessment with all typical items, all adapted items, or a combination of both. You do not need to make the decision ahead of time. You can decide item by item, and if you choose to give a typical item, but the student answers incorrectly, you can follow that question with the adapted version of the question, if you believe that the student has a partial understanding of that skill. On a side note, knowing that we have some students that need further support answering questions, if we have a student who, for example, has a vision impairment and needs materials enlarged, that would be an accommodation. If you ask the student a typical item with an accommodation, you would not check the adaptation box on your assessment scoring sheet. Only check the adaptation box when you ask the adapted form of the question. Do not change or modify the question for your students. However, you can provide your student with thoughtful accommodations to support their individual communication style. Let's take a look at an example from the assessment. This is item 2 from the algebra subtest. The item number is located directly above the instructions for the problem. In this example, the directions state, "Show the student response booklet." On the back pages of the response booklet is where students can show written work if the question calls for it. I will now follow the directions and read the column headings to my student. I then say, write the number in the second column to show how the pattern grows. For a typical item, I should not give any more prompting or guidance to my student. With that being said, keep in mind that this is not a standardized test. If I need to reread the directions or clarify directions within reason, I can do so. Once the student understands the directions, they can record their response. If the student writes 3, 6, 9, they have demonstrated a full understanding of that item. I will score a 1 for that item on their student response booklet and move on to the next item. If my student is not able to answer the typical item, or the adapted item is more appropriate, you can look at the directions under the word adaptation. In this example, it says to show the student the assessment page, referring to the page in the assessment flipbook. I will read the headers on each of the columns to my student. This column says figure. This column says number of blocks. I then point to the blank space and say, show the number that goes here in the growing pattern. I will then present my students with the pocket chart and show them the choices of 5, 1, and 3. If the student selects, points, eye gazes, whatever their mode of communication is, to the number 3, I then can see that my student is demonstrating partial understanding of the concept of a growing pattern. I will mark a 1 on the student response booklet for correct, and then I will place a check mark in the A column, indicating that I asked the student the adapted version of the question. I will need this information later when I score the assessment. In this assessment example, I am assessing my student in the algebra subtest. As I look over the objectives, I'm confident that my student would be able to answer items 1 through 4 correctly, so I can begin with item 5. My student is able to answer items 5 through 9 correctly, so I have established my basal. I can now continue on with the final items of the subtest. When I score this subtest, I will give my student full credit for the questions 1 through 4, along with other correct items as well. If it is your first time administering the assessment, you may choose to start with the first question so you can familiarize yourself with the items as well as the format. But remember that this is a time-saving option that you can use as you move forward. In this example, the teacher decided to start with item 5, but the student missed item 7. In this case, the teacher will go back to item 2 and see if the student can establish the basal for that subtest. Then, the teacher can continue with this subtest until the ceiling is reached or the items end for that subtest. Now here is an example of the ceiling. Looking at the algebra subtest still, the student started with item number 1 and at item 5 began to struggle. The student answered 5 items incorrectly in a row. The ceiling was reached, the teacher ended that subtest, and moved on to the numbers and operations subtest. For numbers and operations, the student missed items 5 through 8 and answered 9 correctly, so the teacher will need to continue until the student misses 5 in a row. Again, when the ceiling is reached, stop assessing that subtest and continue on until you have assessed all subtests. Now, some teachers will say, my student knows this or knows the next question. This isn't the point of the assessment. You want to use this assessment to place your students in the correct chapter within the curriculum. Looking at the student's score sheet, you can see the holes in their math knowledge. It doesn't matter how many they get right, it is about the student making the connections to math and strengthening their skills by developing their prior knowledge. After you have assessed a student, you will need to score their student response booklet. The following information for the assessment, as well as the directions for scoring, are found in the Pre-Algebra and Pre-Geometry Overview Manual. Let's look at how to score the assessment. For each subtest, you will count the number of items correct, all of the ones. That will produce a raw score for each subtest area. You will then go back to the scoring sheet and count up the check marks under the A column indicating the adapted items. When counting the check marks, you will only count the check marks for the items that the student answered correctly. It might help to write the check marks in a different color if the student missed that adaptation question. If the student missed the adaptation question, it is important to have that information so that you can be aware of the level of support needed when that objective is presented to the student. However, you don't want to double penalize when it comes time to adjust the score. We already will not be counting the item because of the 0. I do not want to take off an additional half point as well. Also, when scoring the assessment, be sure to give the student full credit for any items preceding the basal in all subtests. We are assuming that if a student can establish the basal in a subtest, they also have an understanding of the earlier objectives in that particular subtest. Include that count in the raw score. When you are scoring the subtests, you have the option to print a scoring sheet from the members-only content. As you are counting up the raw scores and adaptations for each subtest, you will be able to record that information on this sheet. This will be helpful the first few times you administer and score the assessment. Once you have all your subtest scores, you can add the raw scores together. Now you will need to add together all of the adapted items your student answered correctly. Along the bottom of the sheet, it says Scoring Calculator. You will record your total for the raw score and the total correct adaptations. To find the adjusted raw score, you will take your total of correct adaptations, in this example it is 20, and multiply that number by 0.5, because the adaptation questions are worth half of a point. Now, you can subtract that number, which is 10, from your total raw score of 72. 72 take away 10 is 62. Your student's adjusted raw score is 62. This adjusted raw score will correspond with a suggested starting point within the curriculum. In the overview manual, you will find the suggested start point chart. You can see that if we look at the 62, the suggested start point is section G, Numbers and Operations, Equivalent Fractions. Now teachers can look at the information that they've gathered from the assessment, they can look at the lesson objectives in that section and the section before that, and find the most successful starting point for their student. Here are some tips to make administering the assessment a little easier. Read through the assessment introduction in Appendix A located in the Overview Manual. Assess one subtest at a time to all students. If you focus on just one subtest at a time, you will get to know that subtest well and will be able to anticipate assessment items that are coming and any support your students may need. Prepare your equals assessment box so everything is ready before you begin assessing. Print or locate the student response booklet and the assessment items document. The assessment items document will show you which assessment item aligns to specific lessons in pre-algebra and pre-geometry. As we conclude this webinar, I would like to thank you for your time today. The equals pre-algebra and pre-geometry curriculum provides consistency and support as students are introduced to new math skills. If you have any questions or would like to request a live training for the equals pre-algebra and pre-geometry curriculum, please contact a curriculum team representative at curriculum@ableninc.com. We look forward to hearing from you.